Bill, oh my gosh, where do we start, Bill Kristol? Holy shit. And I can say
That's
that.
well said. Well said. Yeah.
I mean, how are you feeling about the state of our democracy?
Well, better than 2 weeks ago in the sense that I think we'll be better off with Joe Biden as president than Donald Trump, but worried about the damage that's been done by Trump, frankly, and by a lot of other people enabling Trump, and of course by some conditions that preceded Trump, and by what's going to happen over the next 2 months and the future of the Republican Party and conservatism. So I'm not. I heaved a sigh of relief after the election got pretty much resolved, even though Trump doesn't quite admit it. But only a sigh of relief because there are a heck of a lot of challenges ahead.
Well, let's, I mean, where do we go from that? I mean, how do you see this playing out, Bill? Do you think ultimately, begrudgingly, Donald Trump is going to concede? Is he going to hold on until he basically gets pried out of the White House with a crowbar? What's going to happen?
I mean, yeah, I don't know if he'll actually concede. He'll at some point acknowledge, he'll say the election was stolen from him, and he can't, unfortunately, overturn the rigged election because the courts are in on the rigging and everyone's in on the rigging. But he will leave, and he will leave and he'll do whatever he does in terms of building his own TV network. But I worry a lot that he won't. There's not been the Republicans in the 2 weeks since the election, by going along with Trump, have strengthened him an awful lot. I mean, they've strengthened his narrative. They've legitimized his narrative. They've set him up to be a major figure, at least on the Republican side of things, for the next months and maybe years.
You wrote a piece, just wrote a piece called "Be Alarmed," and you said, be alarmed, but it's actually not threatening. Something along those lines. I mean, at what point will you be alarmed?
Well, I'm alarmed by some of the things he's doing, but I think the good news is, and this has always been the question, right, Katie, for the Trump presidency, how strong are the institutions? How strong is the country? How strong are our different governmental institutions, private sector institutions, the media, the bar, the private sector, civil society, in terms of resisting a demagogic president who really has no respect for our norms and traditions and often for our laws. And I think the good news is the institutions are pretty strong, and this isn't Argentina or Hungary or a place where if you get the wrong person in the presidency for 4 years, he can rig things so that he stays in. He can really corrupt or suborn, in a sense, the judiciary, the media. We have federalism, which has been healthy here. It makes it harder for the president to run everything. Having said that, the one institution that hasn't stood up against him is the Republican Party, and therefore Congress, which is, of course, related because Republicans have controlled part of some of Congress for those years. And there, I hate to see one of our two major parties still basically following the lead of a nationalist, populist, nativist demagogue. And I'm worried that it's going to be much harder to liberate the Republican Party from that than I had hoped a few weeks ago.
Well, let's talk about these Republicans who aren't speaking out. People like Mitch McConnell, even worse, Lindsey Graham, who's supporting all of his efforts. I just interviewed the Secretary of State of Georgia, and he basically, Lindsey Graham called him exerting some pressure, kind of suggesting he shouldn't count some legal ballots. I mean, it's insane. But is it just raw power? Is it this craven desire to maintain your position? Is it the recognition that 72 million Americans voted for Donald Trump? Many of these people in the states where these senators come from, and they don't want to lose their grip on power?
Yeah, I think that last one's important. I'm part of this group, Republicans for the Rule of Law, that's at different other groups that are related, Republican Voters Against Trump. We just put up $500,000. Actually, we raised some money of ads in Georgia thanking the Georgia Secretary of State for behaving in a principled and frankly normal way. I mean, would either of us have thought 4 years ago that you had to tell a secretary, you had to go up with ads in a state to help, and he's not asked for this, but I think it will help him push back against the pressure he's getting, not just from Trump and from Lindsey Graham. The two Republican senators in Georgia have attacked the Secretary of State of Georgia for running what everyone says is quite a clean and impressive, given that they've had some troubles there before, election campaign. There might be one or two of the usual kinds of things where a few hundred votes got skipped over and they're now finding them in the audit. It's totally above board, totally actually the way you kind of want our elections run, huge turnout, a close election. and being attacked not just by Trump, fine, he's a sore loser, but again, it's for me, it's the attacks by the two Republican senators, incidentally, who are both were 5 years ago, 8 years ago, totally establishment Republicans, business types, very, Atlanta business community, kinds of people. You thought they might be responsible Republicans. You may like them, you may dislike them, depending on what you think of their economic policies and so forth. But for them to go along with this insane rhetoric implying not just that he's made mistakes, but he is sort of a corrupt figure, a tool of international interest. The CIA is collaborating on this. I mean, you're really in the fever swamps of conspiracies, and that's being tolerated by, enabled by, in some cases, echoed in some cases, by Republican senators, governors, other leaders, and some conservatives around the country, is really bad for the country. I mean, people watch it and they think, well, maybe there's something to that. It's not just Trump who's saying it; these senators are saying it, and they lose faith in the system. It's really does damage.
Well, what the hell happened to the Republican Party, Bill?
Well, it turns out there were some problems. There were always problems. We knew there were problems. The problems were probably deeper or slightly worse than people like me thought. We fought back. We fought against most of those demagogic attempts, though, to reshape the Republican Party, Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul, and I thought we had beat them. Trump was able to exploit certain tendencies, a kind of nativism, anti-immigration sentiment, hatred of liberal elites, which he took it from sort of a, we don't like them much, we want people to stand up a little more to them, to a kind of insane, we don't care about anything except making them feel miserable. And now it's all tribalism. It's all about hatred of the other team, people who support the other side team, as well as a lot of just nativism and bigotry. There are many people who vote Republican because they just prefer the Republican policies, and they put aside what they don't like about Trump, and they don't like it much, a lot of people. But I think that's a big mistake, because they're putting aside something that's doing a huge amount of damage. And you can see how people get to that thinking. You've been in many situations, as I have, and business and social life. You sort of, I'm going to ignore this part of the thing I don't like. I think there are the good things about this person, and that's often, of course, a reasonable thing to do. It's not a reasonable thing to do when the other things about this person are about a president of the United States who is using his presidency to sell conspiracy theories, to whip up hatred and bigotry and divisiveness and kind of know-nothingism to a degree that's really unusual in modern American politics. We've had some not so great presidents of both parties, but none of them has used the presidency in that way in recent times.
How do you get the Republican Party back? I mean, is it you yourself a Republican in the tradition of Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Bob Dole, George W. Bush? I know you're irritated that George W. Bush didn't speak out more during the election. He was one of the few Republicans who congratulated Joe Biden. But is that party gone, or are you optimistic you can get it back?
I mean, I'm not optimistic about getting it back. Whether you could start something, in a sense, a new birth almost, with a new generation of Republicans, I think that's possible. I run into a ton of people, I'm sure you do too, who don't like the current situation. They don't want to have they kind of agree with Republicans on certain issues, but they don't want a nativist, demagogic, bigoted, conspiratorialist party. And so there's a lot of people out there, I think, who provide a potential. But the elected officials have been so timid and cowardly, and the voters have Trump has really brought them along to a degree that it's going to be tougher to bring them back than I would have thought. And I think the big thing there is the election. I mean, Trump lost, but Republicans picked up House seats. They lost only one Senate seat. They, I think, lost no state legislative chambers. So they don't feel like they have to change course. They feel they're going to win the House in 2022, probably. They have a good shot at the presidency in 2024. They'll have to put up with Joe Biden for 4 years. But they don't feel the necessity, not only not to repudiate Trump, but even to really, change course. They don't think that, oh my God, this was kind of a bad 4 years and we need to go in a different direction. They think it was kind of an awkward 4 years. We could do without some of Trump's personal craziness. Maybe we can get a kind of Trumpism with a human face, a kinder, gentler version of Trump. But they're not really repudiating it. And I think that's bad for the country.
We're talking to Republican, gosh, what do I call you, Bill?
I don't know. Former Republican, disaffected Republican.
Bill Kristol. Do you think Don Jr. stands to inherit sort of Trumpism in 2024? I mean, and do you think that Donald Trump is going to run again in 2024?
I think he'll certainly talk about it to try to keep his leverage I have no idea what, how things play out. That's a long time, as we know. And I have friends who just like Trump, as I do, and think he's bad for the party and bad for the country, who are more optimistic than I, in the sense that they think once he's out of office, a lot of the charm goes, a lot of the power goes, a lot of the, it's one thing to land at Air Force One and you're the president and you're, whoa, fantastic. It's another thing, come out to a rally for some guy who's been out of office for a year and is complaining about the people in office. Is that really is? So maybe a lot of the power goes, but I worry that whether it's Don Jr. or various senators or governors or other aspiring media figures. I mean, the market, what Trump has showed is that there's a pretty big market for this. He showed that by winning in 2016. He showed it by coming pretty close in 2020. And he showed that Republicans who played to that market, if I could put it that way, didn't pay a price, right? I mean, it's not as if you were a Trumpy member of the House, you look at those election returns and you think, oh my God, I better rethink some of this. You look at the election returns and you think, that was okay. I'm still here. We gained House seats. We only lost one Senate seat. Let's see how it plays out. So I wish the election had been a more decisive, honestly, repudiation of Trump and Trumpism.
Well, I think a lot of people were really surprised at how deep his support was and how wide his support was. 72 million people is not, a small number of votes. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about truth decay. That's something that President Obama has brought up. The RAND report came out in 2018. We're seeing the impact of these alternate sets of facts, even out in COVID cases, where a nurse is saying people are getting off ventilators and still insisting that COVID isn't real. I mean, this has a real world implication with things that are lies that are being spread and perpetuated, conspiracy theories. It's reinforcing the tribalism. Now we hear about Donald Trump wanting to buy Newsmax possibly, or One American News, because he's mad at Fox because they're not pro-Trump enough. I mean, how do we get back to, or are we at the point of no return, where a fact is actually a fact and not subject to interpretation, and they're two sets of truth?
I mean, I'm worried about that. You mentioned the nurse. Maybe you're thinking of that, like it was Twitter,
yes,
thing. That nurse was very moving and really horrifying. I agree, though. And you felt, I mean, ages ago, I think my father said, a liberal, a neoconservative, this was 40 years ago, is a liberal who's mugged by reality. And it was kind of a joke, but the implication was, reality makes a difference. If markets work and socialism doesn't, well, eventually people learn maybe we should respect free markets more. If whatever, a million different issues you could apply that to, obviously, both on left and right. And what seems here is I kind of thought with COVID, honestly, it was a terrible thing, but I thought, okay, we're being bugged by reality. We're seeing what's happening when we have a president who isn't serious about organizing the federal government to do what needs to be done. It's all about his psychology and his re-election and things he wants to do and doesn't want to do. And he didn't pay much of a price for it. And people now have all kinds of other views about about the public health facts, which are facts, as you say. So that's worrisome and dangerous. Some of it's, I don't know, there are a million reasons for that, I'm sure, and people could talk a lot about those. But the conspiratorial stuff is the stuff that worries me the most. And I don't know what you've thought about this a lot too. I know. I mean, if someone has a foolish view and it doesn't work out, you sort of say, well, gee, that turned out not to be correct, right? The thing about conspiracy theories is they're kind of not falsifiable, right? I mean, right. They're sort of self-reinforcing. It's just if the conspiracy theory seems not to be, if you can't prove it, that's just because they succeeded in hiding the proof even more. And it's not just George Soros, it's the CIA. And it's not just the CIA, it's foreign governments. And so you get a kind of craziness, honestly. Now, normally in American politics, that kind of burns itself out. People are pretty commonsensical. Ultimately, they live in their communities, they go to their jobs, they have their families. And maybe that will be the case too here. Trump is an unusually good demagogue of that kind, and he has enough, I don't know what exactly, appeal to people that they put up with some of the stuff they think is a little crazy. But the degree to which he's now, I mean, this post-election period does have me, you said I wrote that piece about how I'm alarmed. It has me rattled a little bit because people are believing things that are just nuts. that are really just nuts. That, that honestly, the CIA, which Trump has controlled, of course, for 4 years, and foreign governments and election officials of Republican and Democratic Party, and they're all colluding with private sector people on these computers, and they're flipping votes. And, our elections are pretty carefully, people watch them pretty closely. If you followed stuff about election night and afterwards, you kind of watched the votes coming in, and you saw where they were coming from, and it happened the way it happened, but it made a certain amount of sense. And then there are a couple of questions about some places that, the idea that there's some massive conspiracy is really crazy. And the number of people who believe it is pretty high. The number of people who don't want to challenge those who believe it is even higher. And you just don't know. Maybe that fades a little bit and people kind of come back to their senses, but it's a little hard to build back that public trust. So many people have written about this. You need a kind of basic trust among citizens for a country to function.
Especially during the pandemic. It seems
Well, what about that? The anti-mask stuff? I mean, how crazy? It's just crazy. I mean, and
you have this Dr. Atlas basically telling people in Michigan to rise up against Greta Whitmer when she's trying to come up with, I mean, that to me is really scary and so weird that you have someone who is the main spokesman for the administration on COVID, basically telling people in Michigan to not accept this and to rise up. Right. What the hell?
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, so part of it is crazy in my view, just not to understand why, from a public health point of view, you want to, wear a mask and be considerate of your fellow Americans or anyone you run into. And so that's one thing. But then the second thing, incidentally, is even if you're not sure about the medical benefits, why not err on the side of caution, right? I mean, you're talking about people's lives and deaths, the kind of selfishness that's been glorified almost. I don't care about anyone else. My freedom means I don't wear a mask. What is that? That's not a traditional American thing when we're facing a public health threat of this kind. So again, Trump has kind of liberated a certain kind of selfishness, a certain kind of cruelty, I'm going to say. I mean, someone made this point ages ago that, the cruelty with Trump is not a bug, it's a feature. And there's a kind of, fake macho toughness, but a kind of, I don't care about those other people. We can tough our way through. And then, of course, you get the tragic scenes in the emergency rooms in the ICU where people discover that, you can't be tough enough to beat this virus if you're unlucky enough to get it. So all of that is very, is very worrisome, obviously.
Yeah, as someone just pointed out, towards our healthcare workers.
Well, that's it. I'm just the selfish. If people tell you, if the governor says do this, do it, or make an argument against doing it. Call up your state legislator. The idea that you go to the state capitol with weapons and you quote that the president's senior advisor says rise up. What does that mean? I challenged him, and many others did on Twitter and elsewhere, and he said, "Oh no, I'm not calling for violence. I'm just saying people should vote or express their opinion peacefully." Really? We just voted. I mean, there's no election to vote in, and if it's the laws of Michigan, you can peacefully disobey, I suppose, civil disobedience, and take the consequences. But rise up does not sound like that, right? And that's not the image one has. He's telling people basically ignore these laws because if you find it inconvenient. And as a result, we have a huge spike now, and many other countries do too. So it's not just us. It's hard to stay, obviously, quarantined and socially distanced for 6, 8, 9 months. Europe's having problems. But in Europe, they're having problems, and the government says, okay, unfortunately, we're having a recurrence. We've got to be serious now and limit gatherings and wear masks. And people mostly say, okay, we've got to do that. And then they get it back under control. For us to be, having this go off the charts now in the US with our ability with our healthcare system, which is good, and our, ability to do a lot of things in terms of therapeutics and stuff. I mean, it really is a failure of the country. So we can blame Trump, and I'm happy to do that. But we also have to look at ourselves and at least some part of the country and say, what is going on here?
Let me ask you just some nuts and about, is this from Henry Molnar?
Yeah.
Oh, my stepson just wanted me to ask you a question. Wait, Bill, we're losing you. Fix your phone.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I want your
So
kids
unusual. I guess
out of you. So he says, how do we incentivize moral behavior from politicians, especially from a political system that relies so heavily on precedent? Do you feel that politics is going to further degrade into a state of perpetual retribution? How can we adjust the political calculus to encourage compromise at all levels of politics? Thank you, Henry.
No, it's a good question. I mean, look, the partisanship and hyperpolarization was there already Trump has obviously accentuated it. No one believes anyone from the other side of the aisle. It doesn't seem that politicians are rewarded for trying to work together on issues. That could change. I think Biden's instinct is to be more of a consensus politician. And I hope that enough Republicans say, yes, let's legalize the Dreamers. No one really disagrees with that, right? That's an 80% issue. So Biden doesn't have to do every liberal thing he wants to do on immigration. The Republicans can give up on some of their stuff. Can we do something like that? And could we have some Republicans vote for that when Biden proposes it? That doesn't seem like an extraordinary ask. But I worry that the polarization and the partisanship is so embedded and that it's going to be hard to overcome.
Let's talk about the transition. You've been in government. How damaging is this? We heard President-elect Biden say that more lives would be lost if they cannot have a good transition, especially when it comes to COVID, distributing vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, are you concerned not only from a domestic policy standpoint, from a national security standpoint, where, Mike Esper is fired and all these Trump loyalists are running the Pentagon? I mean, it is like a bad movie. Let's be honest.
It's amazing. And, so I was part of this group that did these little scenarios to see what could go wrong in the transition, assuming Trump behaved this way, whether he won or lost, actually. And I played Trump with a couple other people. They were little teams, and I was allegedly, I don't know why, I can get in Trump's head. So I played Trump, I guess because I'm a Republican.
And put on bronzer?
Yeah, it was wonderful. Yeah, right. So one of the things I did, actually, one of these scenarios, was like, okay, well, that goes through stages. So what do you do the day after the election? So I got to announce, what we're doing. And I said, I'm firing Esper because I want someone more compliant at defense. And there's very smart people, most of whom have been in government and, lawyers and law professors and, media types and all this. And there's a big reaction, actually. Oh, come on. No president's ever done that. Well, he's just going to fire the Secretary of Defense for 2 months to put someone in there who's much more compliant with him. Not only did he do that, and people haven't noticed this as much, at the second and third tier, he put in people who honestly are even less qualified than Chris Miller and who are more sort of pure Trump loyalists. Now, will all that amount to anything, or is it all just, kind of pettiness and vindictiveness? It's probably mostly pettiness and vindictiveness, but I am worried about some of the consequences in foreign policy. I think in terms of Biden, he's the former vice president, and he was only out of office 4 years ago, and his team is very experienced, and Senator Harris has been a senator, obviously. So I actually don't think, having been through one of these transitions, you can do okay if you get the General Services Administration cooperating on December 15th instead of November 15th. It's not the end of the world. But, you do lose some things and it gets harder. And we are in the middle of a pandemic. That for me is also amazing. I guess people are not outraged enough about this. He is the president of the United States. This thing is taking off and he's literally doing nothing. He's like, maybe he would have not great policies, but he's literally not convening a meeting of the coronavirus task force. I'm not sure anyone else is either. Vice President Pence is going to Georgia to campaign for the 2 Republican senators on Friday. Is he doing anything to make sure we're producing enough masks and PPE and distributing them to the places testing to the places that are now under huge pressure?
Not to mention vaccine distribution, which has got to be ramped up.
Yeah, and that's a big challenge. Now there, I think, Trump has invested a lot, so to speak, in the vaccine, so he presumably has an interest in making sure that goes on. And look, we do have a very, there are a lot of people in the federal government who are doing their jobs and working on this, and the Biden team will take over. So I think we'll pick up a lot of that. But look, again, yeah, the idea that in a pandemic like this, we're not, if Trump wants to contest the election irresponsibly and do some damage to the country, I guess he can do that. But you think he could at the same time say, but look, for the pandemic related stuff, that's so serious that in case Biden wins, I've asked everyone to cooperate with his incoming team. Is that such a hard thing to ask? And what's amazing is not just that Trump doesn't do it because he's totally narcissistic and doesn't think about the good of the country, but that Pence doesn't tell him he should do it, or the Secretary of HHS doesn't say he should do it, or the Senate chairman, the chairman of the different committees don't say, Mr. President, you've really got to do this. And that, for me, that's the collapse. The collapse is not only Trump, it's all the enablers and the acquiescers around him.
Someone asked if there is any legal recourse to his lack of cooperation in the transition. Is there anything that can be done to pressure him?
Not much, I don't think, in the courts, but I jokingly, I guess, tweeted yesterday, I think 2 days ago. I mean, Vice President Pence has a job. He's elected vice president. He can't be fired by Trump. Why doesn't he just step up and start doing some of these things? Let Trump, overrule him if he wants. But I just think as a decent human being, almost, you would try, if you were in there, to do these things. I do think Fauci and a lot of people are trying to do these things at their levels. And probably they can get, 80% of the stuff done without, ignoring the White House. But
Mike Pence has political ambitions in 2024. He doesn't want to be seen as working against Trump and ergo Trump's base. So he's kind of stuck, isn't he?
Well, exactly. But I mean, think about the implications of what you just said. That I mean, because of his ambitions, for 4 years from now, was head of the task force. Do you think
I'm not justifying it. I'm just
No, I understand. I'm saying, but it's so revealing that we're both saying this and agreeing that Mike Pompeo was against pulling down to 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. I know that he made the argument against that both before he joined the administration and when he was in Congress, and then in the last few years. And now he says nothing because Trump wants to do it because he, vaguely believes we shouldn't be in these foreign places. He could have pulled out at any time, obviously on his watch. But no, he pulls out now after the election, which is really unheard of to make a major decision like that when you're a lame duck, when there's no necessity, there's no urgency, and leaves Biden in a very difficult position, which is why I think he's doing it, with so few troops that it's not clear they can really sustain it. So Biden would either have to send back some troops or pull the rest out, and then the embassy conceivably falls, and you have a Saigon 1975 type situation. I mean, again, the cynicism of what Trump is doing, but he's doing it abetted by his national security advisor and the Secretary of State, and Vice President certainly aren't objecting. So it's a pretty bad moment. I mean, I guess the more I talk, I'm getting more and more depressed. That's terrible, But isn't Instagram supposed to be cheerful and light and, full of young people having fun? I don't know. I feel like I'm a real Debbie Downer here on Instagram. But anyway, it is a tough moment. Young people need to come in. I really will say this, since I think you probably have a younger audience than I'm used to talking to. People need to come into public life and into politics and improve things. I mean, it is not, this is not the time. I mean, this is, in a way, it's a moment of opportunity in that respect. The system is so obviously broken. Things have gone so off the rails that I do think there would be a big response to people showing up and saying we need to fundamentally change things. So I don't think we all need to just keep marching down the path we're on.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. We got some quick questions from social media because I want to be responsive to people who are nice enough to join us for these smart conversations with very smart people like you, Bill. Well, I asked you this, but how do Republicans move from being the party of Trump to actually being Republicans again? You sort of answered that, but is there anything specific other than getting young people involved? Is there anything else that you see a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I mean, when he's out of office, I think you'll see senators and governors speaking up a little more and standing up a little more. But it takes courage. It takes leadership. It takes someone just to say, you know what, this may not work. I may lose my next election, but I'm now going to say what the party should and shouldn't stand for. And it should stand for legalizing the Dreamers. And it should stand for reasonable help for people who are suffering from economic relief for COVID. And we need to move on that now. And I don't care if Mitch McConnell is going to be mad at me. And I don't care if I'm going to be attacked on Fox or OAN or whatever. But it's been remarkable how few people are willing to say even that.
Yeah. Will the never Trump Republicans leave the Republican Party and make a new one?
I think it's more possible than I would have thought before that you could have, a third party or a grouping maybe in the center that tries to work with people in both parties who are more moderate and interested in governing. I think that would be healthy. I'm personally pretty interested in trying to do some of that. There are a lot of, I think, moderate, for all the publicity, the sort of young, the AOC types get in the Democratic Party, and I have no, it's fine. She's done a good job of getting herself a lot of attention and advancing her ideas. There are a lot of moderate Democrats who got elected in 2018 here in Virginia. There are 3 or 4 members of Congress, 3 really, who won in 2018, got reelected in swing districts, who were very impressive and are much more, moderate, I'd say, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden type Democrats. And Biden's president. I guess the one thing I would say that cuts against all my gloom and doom is I think Biden could be a more consequential and impressive president than people think.
Well,
I think he's the right person for the time. I'm not sure anyone else could have won, incidentally.
Well, that's funny because I had that question. Could anyone else have beaten Donald Trump? And someone asked, what do you see as immediate must-dos for Joe Biden when he enters office on January 20th?
The pandemic. I think he'd be wise, both from the point of view of the country's well-being and politically, frankly, to focus on the pandemic right away and economic relief, to handle the consequences of it. The faster that gets under control, the faster the economy gets back. Frankly, some of my liberal friends won't like this, but I think put some of the more liberal things on a back burner for the first 6 to 9 months, build up a big support for what you're doing. And then, 6 to 9 months in, if we're kind of through the worst of the pandemic, the vaccine's been distributed effectively, the economy's coming back, and then there's a million things he'll want to do, and there'll be the normal debates about them. But I think getting off to a strong start is important. And I say this as an American, really, not a Republican, and I was for Biden, but not a Biden supporter even. It's important for the country that Biden have a successful presidency, or at least have a successful start to his presidency, and restore some sense that government can function, that we can have a president who puts the country first, that he can work with people to some degree in both parties and run a competent administration. And it would be really bad for the country if everything just falls apart under Biden. I don't think it will. I think he's off to a good start in terms of the people he's appointing and so forth. But
yeah, you're saying build up some political capital by doing some basic bipartisan things that will help everyone, although you would think the pandemic is bipartisan.
Well, I do think it'll be hard for Republicans to oppose him if he says we should, he can make some compromises, but we need to help people, keep their unemployment insurance. We need to help small businesses stay open until we get to the end of the time. We now see a little bit, our path out of the forest here with the vaccines. We just need to prevent everyone from going under in the meantime, and then do our best to curb obviously just the human effects of this disease, which again, I come back to, Biden has been so much more responsible than Trump. Even as president-elect, he's trying to tell people to behave responsibly and listen to their state and local officials and make some tough decisions in terms of not seeing the people you'd like to see on Thanksgiving and stuff. I mean, Trump has just been so absent, and really his administration mostly has been utterly absent in that respect.
Hey, before we go, Bill, I wanted to ask you about Mitch McConnell. I interviewed him when he wrote a book, and he said he never said, the first thing on his agenda was to keep Barack Obama from being reelected to a second term. He said that was misinterpreted. But, is there any chance that he might, with a Joe Biden to work with, suddenly become a bit more magnanimous and a bit more open to basically coming up with agreeing on something or compromising on some important issues that are so fundamental to this country?
I think so. I've been a little more hopeful than some people. I mean, I'm worried about these last 2 weeks because it just shows where the Republican Party is. But, one way he would, of course, be being more inclined to be helpful is if Mitt Romney and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, just to take 3 Republican senators, went to him and said, Mitch, we're not supporting you in all these other things you need our support on unless you do agree to work with President Biden on A, B, or C. It's not like these other senators they are senators. They're not appointed by Mitch McConnell to their jobs. And I just mentioned the 3 who are maybe most obvious who could do this, but there are a lot of others. And I think it's important to put pressure on them if you're in their states and say, why are you just sitting around, letting in this kind of trench warfare and utterly unconstructive kind of fighting, obviously oppose the president on things you care a lot about, oppose some of his nominees if you think they'd be bad cabinet officers, but don't have a kind of scorched earth policy. So I think McConnell, he's gotten a lot of what he wanted done. He got the judges. So maybe he'll be a little more inclined that way. He knows Biden, obviously they've worked together, but I think it would help if there were pressure on McConnell. Maybe there will be. I haven't talked directly to Romney or Murkowski or Collins about this, so I'm just making this up, so to speak. But they want to get something done. Mitt Romney doesn't want to be a senator here in his 70s just to sit around casting votes that Mitch McConnell tells him to cast. So I wonder if there's a little more opportunity for breakthroughs than conventional wisdom would have it. And that would be very good for the country. I mean, just from the country's point of view, seeing some progress on some of these issues, even if the policies aren't perfect, obviously, would be a healthy thing.
Well, let's leave on that positive note.
Yeah, I know. I feel like we should do that. I think. Well, I'll come back on sometime when we have good news to discuss, and we can.
I would love that.
We can be cheerful.
Thanks a lot for joining Instagram so we could have this conversation, and it's great just to have these talks. Sometime I would love to talk to you about people who are just so committed to Donald Trump, what that's about, and how support of him has become a proxy for something else altogether. And I interviewed Mitch Albom. I don't know if you know Mitch, but we talked about, somehow we have to stop demonizing people who are supporting or for whatever reason gravitate or attracted to Donald Trump, and understand each other better. I mean, we said this in 2016. I did a whole hour on traveling around the country trying to understand it. So a lot of this is kind of platitudes, but there's got to be some way to take out this very primal hatred and anger that seems to be the undercurrent for all these conversations, right? And even people who are writing comments, it's sort of, and I have to be careful about the way I'm positioning things too. We have to kind of, I think, be more gentle with each other. But on the other hand, if you feel like this is an existential crisis for our democracy, it's hard to go easy on the person you feel that is responsible for that. It's complicated.
Well, this is where I do think his going from the Oval Office is a big opportunity, because whatever he'll be around, he'll be tweeting, he'll be giving speeches and rallies, and there'll be a lot of people who want his support. But there will be a moment, there'll be less, just what you put it very well. I mean, it'll be more of an opportunity to say, okay, we've had those 4 years. We don't need to revisit all that. We don't need to blame everyone who voted for him. That's not what we did at Republican Voters Against Trump. We said, change your mind. That's fine. We understand why you might have been attracted to him in the first place. But let's now have a conversation going forward. And I think that is an opportunity beginning on January 20th.
And I also think, the media has to be careful about, I think many people, journalists, news organizations have learned that they don't have to cover his every move. They won't have to cover. I think they have they're thinking a lot about the way they covered this presidency, because it was so unconventional, to put it mildly. And I think that they should feel under no pressure to really follow his every move or his every tweet. And perhaps that'll give the entire country a chance to exhale.
Let's hope so. From your lips to God's ears,
If you guys like what you see, subscribe right here.